For 10 years, Nell Castellano hadn't spoken a single word, and for 10 years she hadn't taken a single step. She was 19 now, sharp-eyed and silent, and she spent her days in a wheelchair by a third-floor window, filling one sketchbook after another with drawings of the same thing over and over, a pair of human hands. Nobody in that house had ever figured out whose. Her brother Emmett was 34, and in that city his name opened doors that money couldn't. Tall, quiet, dark hair cut short, a thin scar across one knuckle. When he walked into a room, conversations changed direction, and nobody could say who'd decided that. He'd spent a fortune on the best neurologists in the country, and every one of them had told him the same thing: not possible. Then came a Saturday in February, in the banquet room of the Warwick Hotel, in front of 80-some people who'd known Nell since she was a child. Nell Castellano put both hands on the arms of her chair and pushed herself up. She took one unsteady step, then another, walking past the white tablecloths and frozen faces toward a woman in a server's uniform who had dropped to her knees across the room to catch her. A woman nobody in that room could have named a woman Emmett Castellano had thrown out of his house weeks earlier, and had spent every day since trying to figure out how to face again. He stood there beside an empty wheelchair with his hand still on the push handle, and he understood two things at once: that everything the doctors had told him for 10 years was wrong, and that the answer had been inside his own house the whole time, mopping his floors for $340 a week, while he'd never once bothered to ask her a single question. If this is the kind of story you came here for, hit that like button and subscribe so the next one finds you. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it today. It costs you nothing, and on this end, it means everything. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because before you can understand those 12 steps, you have to know what 10 years of silence really cost, and who paid for it. Late that afternoon at the Fox Point waterfront warehouse, wind blew in from the bay and swept between the long rows of stacked shipping containers, while Emmett Castellano sat on a plastic chair inside the temporary construction office, facing a man named Bill Haggerty, the contractor responsible for a shipment of materials that should have arrived long ago. Haggerty talked at length. He talked about the weather, about customs, about a ship being held in Newark, and Emmett allowed him to finish. He didn't interrupt once. He merely sat there with both hands resting on his knees, looking directly into the other man's face with the quiet composure that everyone who had ever done business with the Castellano family knew was the most frightening thing in the room. When Haggerty paused to breathe, Emmett asked him a single question: whether that shipment had ever left the warehouse at all. Haggerty opened his mouth, then closed it. Emmett nodded, as though he had known the answer before entering the room. He glanced at the watch on his wrist, then spoke in a voice so calm that Haggerty had to lean forward to hear him clearly. He said Haggerty still had time to drive home and tell his wife himself before she heard it from someone else, and that if Emmett were in his place, he wouldn't waste any more time sitting there. Then he stood, fastened the button of his coat, and walked outside. He didn't threaten him. He didn't mention a single name. He didn't call anyone during the drive home. His phone remained silent inside his coat pocket, and Pete Lasco drove without asking a question, because he had been with Emmett long enough to understand that quiet afternoons like this were often the most expensive afternoons of someone's life. Before the car turned onto the road leading to the house, 3 of Haggerty's pending contracts had been withdrawn. A call from the bank had reached the telephone in his home, and in a city this small, where everything passed through a handful of old handshakes, no one answered anymore when his name appeared on the screen. Emmett didn't need to order any of it. That was precisely what made people afraid of him. He arrived home after dinner had gone cold and ate alone in the kitchen, standing rather than sitting, with the habit of a man accustomed to regarding a meal as something to be completed, instead of a moment of rest. Mrs. Orla Doyle came out of the laundry room, wiping her hands on her apron, and told him the new maid would begin on Monday morning. He nodded. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where Orla had found her, or why she had made the decision so quickly, this time after 3 maids had resigned in succession during the past 6 months. On the kitchen table, beneath a stack of mail, lay a familiar ivory envelope, the one that arrived every month bearing the name of Dr. Warren Ashby. Emmett took out a pen, turned to the final page, signed it, and pushed it aside. He didn't open it to read. He had stopped reading those papers long ago, because every page inside said the same thing in different words, and he had learned that reading them only made the night longer, without changing anything. Near midnight, he turned off the lights downstairs and went up. The house was large and old, and the staircase leading to the 3rd floor was narrower than those on the 2 floors below, as though the person who had built it long ago had assumed the uppermost level would be reserved for servants. Emmett stopped before the last door in the corridor. There was no sound inside. There was never any sound. He stood there and raised one hand to the doorknob, leaving it there longer than necessary. He could feel the cold metal beneath his palm, the coldness of an inanimate object that knew nothing of the fact that it stood between 2 human beings. He knew what he would say if he turned it. He had composed the sentence inside his mind over many nights, revising it, shortening it, until only a few words remained. But he also knew what would happen afterward. His sister would raise her eyes to him, completely alert, fully understanding, and entirely silent, and once again, he would stand there in a room inside his own home without knowing what to do with his hands. He released the doorknob. He walked to his bedroom at the opposite end of the corridor, and that night, as on every night, the man, an entire city treated with caution, lay down in the darkness and thought about a door he couldn't bring himself to open. On Monday morning, Delia Whitlock arrived well ahead of the appointed time, and she waited across the street for a while before walking through the gate, because arriving too early was another way of drawing attention, and attention was something she had learned to avoid over many years. Mrs. Orla Doyle opened the side door, led her into the servants' dining room, poured her a cup of tea that she didn't touch, then sat across from her. She didn't open a personnel file. She didn't ask what Delia had done during the blank period in her history, a gap so long that anyone who gave it the slightest thought would notice it immediately. Nor did she ask why a woman of 27 had arrived without a single letter of reference, or even one name they could call to verify her past. Delia had prepared answers to those questions. She had rehearsed them silently throughout the bus ride that morning, and now she sat there with those unused answers weighing heavily inside her chest. Mrs. Doyle merely explained that the work involved cleaning the lower 2 floors, doing the laundry, and occasionally helping in the kitchen, 6 days a week, for $340 paid every Friday. Then she said there were 3 things Delia needed to remember, and she spoke slowly, one at a time, like someone who had repeated these words many times and still considered them important. First, she wasn't to go up to the 3rd floor. Second, she wasn't to ask any questions about the family, even if someone else in the kitchen brought up the subject first. Third, whenever the master of the house returned, she was to continue with her work, greet him if he greeted her, and never look directly into his face. Delia asked whether he was a difficult man. Mrs. Doyle was silent for a beat, then said no. He had never spoken harshly to anyone in that house, but some people lived more easily when fewer people remembered their faces, and Delia was the kind of person who should choose that way of living. Delia understood what she meant. She had survived that way for years. She said she would take the job. Mrs. Doyle nodded, stood, handed her an apron that still bore its folding creases, and told her she could begin that very day if it suited her. At the door, after Delia had turned away and walked several steps, Mrs. Doyle remained there with one hand resting against the frame, watching her longer than necessary. Long enough that Delia would have noticed if she had looked back. But Delia didn't look back. Mrs. Doyle returned to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and washed the cup of tea no one had drunk. The house was larger than Delia had imagined, and old in the carefully preserved way of certain homes, with dark wooden floors and a main staircase broad enough for 3 people to walk abreast. She cleaned the 1st floor, then went up to the 2nd, and by late morning, she had recognized something no one had told her. The entire house felt like a box sealed tightly around something hidden above. The kitchen assistant, Marla, a talkative and kind-hearted middle-aged woman, was the one who told her about it, even though she knew she shouldn't. She said that several years earlier, the master had commissioned a room on the 3rd floor, a complete therapy room equipped like a hospital. The equipment had been ordered from Germany, and foreign technicians had flown in to install it over 2 weeks. It had cost enough money to buy a respectable house in that neighborhood. Delia asked what had happened afterward. Marla shrugged and said that when the room was finished, he had pushed his sister upstairs in her wheelchair and opened the door for her. The girl had looked around once, turned her face away, and refused to enter. She hadn't written a single word. The room had remained there ever since, covered with protective sheets. Someone still came every month to remove the dust and inspect the machines, but no one had ever used it, not even once. That afternoon, while carrying clean towels upstairs and placing them inside the cabinet at the head of the second-floor staircase. Delia straightened and accidentally looked toward the narrow flight of stairs leading above. The door at the far end of the corridor stood open by the thinnest crack. Through that sliver of light, she briefly saw a young woman sitting in a wheelchair with her back toward the doorway, her head bent over a sketchbook resting on her lap. The hand holding the pencil moved steadily, slowly, with the concentration of someone working rather than merely passing the time. Delia couldn't see much. She could only tell that there were no landscapes on the page, no faces, no houses or trees. There were only hands. She stepped back, remembering the first of Mrs. Doyle's 3 instructions, and went downstairs. On Thursday afternoon, Marla's back began hurting, and she had to leave early, so Delia was the one who carried a tray of tea upstairs to the master of the house, who had just returned and was speaking on the telephone inside the small study at the end of the corridor. The tray held a porcelain pot filled with freshly boiled water, 1 cup, and a small saucer. She climbed the main staircase slowly and carefully, holding both sides firmly with her hands. As she reached the final step, the toe of her shoe caught on the edge of the carpet, where it had shifted out of place. Her body pitched slightly forward, and the teapot slid across the tray, tipped sideways, and lost its lid. Boiling water spilled over the back of her left hand. Delia didn't cry out. She didn't make a sound. She managed to steady the tray, placed it on the low cabinet at the top of the stairs, then walked directly into the second-floor guest bathroom, turned on the cold faucet, and held her hand beneath the running water. She stood there looking down, her breathing even, her lips pressed together slightly, wearing the expression of someone who had endured far worse and knew precisely what needed to be done. She let the water run long enough, then took a clean towel from the cabinet, wrapped it around her hand, secured the loose edge, went downstairs to prepare another pot of tea, and continued carrying the tray toward the end of the corridor as though nothing had happened. At the head of the staircase leading to the 3rd floor, Nell Castellano sat in her wheelchair behind the wooden railing, where she often came at that hour to look down into the light from the large window. She had seen everything, from the moment the pot slipped until the woman returned with a towel wrapped around her hand. What caught Nell's attention wasn't the burn, because people in this house sometimes cut their fingers, broke things, or struck themselves against the edge of a table. What caught her attention was that the woman hadn't cried out. Then, when that left hand rose to secure the edge of the towel, Nell saw something so small that no one should have noticed it. The little finger on that hand couldn't straighten. It curved at an unusual angle, slightly separated from the other fingers, as though it had once been broken and never properly set. Nell watched it for several seconds. Her heart began beating unreasonably fast, so fast that she had to place one hand on the arm of her chair and release a long breath, and she didn't understand why. She rolled backward into the darkness of the corridor before the woman passed beneath her, and that night, she opened her sketchbook and sat for a very long time without being able to draw anything at all. By the following afternoon, Mrs. Doyle was truly short of help. The maintenance worker who came every month called to say he was unavailable. Marla still couldn't move around properly, and the heating vent on the 3rd floor had become stuck again, leaving the room at the end of the corridor noticeably colder than the rest of the house. Mrs. Doyle stood in the kitchen for a while with one hand braced against the table. Then she called Delia, handed her a screwdriver and a small scrubbing brush, and told her to go upstairs, open the vent, clean it, and come straight back down. She added that Delia wasn't to start a conversation with anyone, and Delia nodded. She went up to the 3rd floor for the first time. The corridor there was narrow, with a low ceiling, and it was as cold as Mrs. Doyle had said. Delia knelt before the heating vent mounted near the base of the wall, placed the screwdriver into the first screw, and began working. Her left hand was still bandaged, so she moved more slowly than usual, and relied more heavily on the strength of her right hand. She heard the quiet sound of wheelchair wheels moving across the wooden floor behind her, but she didn't turn because Mrs. Doyle had warned her not to. The wheels stopped about 2 steps away. Delia kept her head lowered and finished loosening the second screw. Then a voice spoke behind her, hoarse, soft, and breaking slightly at the end. The voice of someone who hadn't used it in a very long time. "It hurts a lot." Delia looked up. She saw a young woman sitting in a wheelchair, staring down at her bandaged hand instead of looking at her face. Delia didn't startle. She didn't cry out in surprise. She had no idea that the words she had just heard were the first spoken in this house after 10 years of silence. No one had told her, and Mrs. Doyle was downstairs in the kitchen, 2 floors away. She merely glanced at her own hand, then looked back at the young woman. "Yes, it hurts," she said. "It hurt more yesterday. It's better today, and in a few days, it'll heal. Things like this heal quickly." Then she added, "You should move back a little where it's warmer. There's a draft here." She turned back to the heating vent, removed the cover, and began scrubbing. Mrs. Orla Doyle was carrying a tray of clean towels toward the final step of the second-floor staircase when she heard it. A voice from above, brief and hoarse, only a few sounds before it fell silent, followed by the new maid answering in the calm tone of someone discussing the weather. Mrs. Doyle froze in the middle of the staircase. The tray slipped from her hands and struck the wooden floor, sending towels tumbling across the steps, but she didn't bend down to retrieve them. She stood there for a moment with one hand gripping the railing, and she felt her legs begin to tremble in the way of someone who had just heard news she had long since stopped hoping she would ever hear. Then she turned and hurried back downstairs, almost running. She didn't take the time to go around to the telephone in the kitchen. Instead, she pulled the phone from her apron pocket, dialed a number, and when someone answered, she managed only 3 words. The girl spoke. At the harbor, Emmett Castellano was seated in the conference room, on the executive floor of Halloran Shipping, facing 4 people, 2 attorneys, and 2 representatives of the landowners. On the table lay the agreement for the southern waterfront property, the agreement he had spent 11 months bringing to this day. The phone vibrated inside his coat pocket. He looked at the screen. He listened. He heard those 3 words, and he rose. He didn't apologize to anyone. He didn't explain. He picked up the coat draped over the back of his chair, told his attorney to continue, and walked toward the door, leaving 4 people staring at one another without understanding what had just happened. In all their years of doing business with him, no one had ever seen Emmett Castellano leave a table before every document on it had been signed. Pete Lasco rose from his chair in the corridor, but Emmett walked past him, went directly to the parking lot, and drove himself. He drove faster than necessary through the wet streets of the November afternoon, and throughout the journey, he couldn't form a single coherent thought. His mind kept repeating those 3 words as though they might vanish if he stopped reminding himself of them. He reached the house, left the car door open, passed Mrs. Doyle standing at the foot of the staircase with her hands clasped together, and went up to the 3rd floor. He walked the length of the narrow corridor until he reached the door where he stopped every night. This time, he opened it without thinking. Nell was sitting beside the window with the sketchbook closed on her lap. She looked up at him. He stood in the doorway, his chest still rising and falling quickly, and called her name. She looked at him. She only looked. He stepped inside and told her that Mrs. Doyle had just called him, that he had heard what happened, and that she could say anything she wanted. Anything at all. Even a single word would be enough. Nell continued looking at him. Then she reached for the sketchbook on her lap, opened it, picked up her pencil, and wrote. She turned the sketchbook around so he could read it. 2 words appeared on the page, vent fixed. Emmett read them. Then he read them again. And the silence in that room closed around him, soft and complete, as though it hadn't cracked open even once during the past 10 years. He didn't ask another question. He had learned long ago that asking more only made her retreat farther away. He stood there for a moment, then did something even he hadn't intended. He stepped forward and knelt before the wheelchair, both knees touching the wooden floor, lowering his face beneath hers. He placed both hands on the arms of the chair beside her hands without touching them. He said nothing more. The man whose name an entire city weighed carefully before speaking. The man who could overturn a person's life simply by glancing at his watch and rising from a table. Knelt on the floor of his own home without knowing what to do next. Nell looked down at him. For one moment, her hand lifted from her lap, rising scarcely an inch before lowering again. Outside the window, darkness had completely fallen. He remained there until his knees went numb. Then he stood, dimmed one of the lamps to make the light more comfortable for her eyes, and walked out, closing the door very gently behind him. Mrs. Doyle came down to the kitchen to find Delia shortly after 7 o'clock that evening, and said the master wanted to see her in the study. The way she spoke told Delia that Mrs. Doyle didn't know where this would lead either. Delia removed her apron, folded it, placed it over the back of a chair, and followed her through the 1st floor corridor. The study contained a large desk of dark wood, 2 walls covered with bookshelves, and a single illuminated desk lamp. Emmett Castellano sat behind the desk, with his coat removed and his sleeves rolled up. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Delia sat with both hands resting in her lap, her left hand still wrapped in a bandage. She remembered the third of Mrs. Doyle's 3 instructions and lowered her eyes toward the desk. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten her. In an ordinary, almost gentle voice, he asked what she had said to his sister on the 3rd floor the previous afternoon. Delia replied that she had said the burn would heal. He asked what else. She said she had told the young woman to move back a little because there was a draft. He asked what his sister had said to her. Delia was silent for a beat, then said that she had told her it hurt a great deal. He asked whether Delia knew what that meant. She said she didn't understand what he meant. Then he fell silent. He didn't ask another question. He merely sat there with both hands resting on the desk, looking at her and allowing the silence to lengthen. Delia had sat before men who knew how to use silence like that before. It was the cheapest and most effective weapon, because people couldn't endure an empty space. They would fill it themselves with things they should never have said. She didn't fill it. She remained still, breathed evenly, and waited. At last, he asked another question. He asked who she was. Delia raised her head, and this time, forgetting the 3rd instruction, she looked directly into his face and said, "I'm the woman who cleans your floors." He studied her for a long time after that. He was skilled at reading people. He had spent his entire life doing it, and he knew what a lie looked like. He knew the posture of someone concealing something, the slight rise of the shoulders, the way the eyes searched for a point on the wall. The woman seated before him showed none of those things, but she also lacked what any ordinary person should have possessed, which was uneasiness. She was calm in the manner of someone who had already lost everything worth losing, and he couldn't read anything from her at all. He told her she could leave. She rose, nodded, and walked toward the door. When her hand closed around the study doorknob, the cold metal beneath her palm suddenly carried her back to another morning and another room, where she had stood before a door in much the same way, knowing that the people inside were deciding the rest of her life. That day, a board had sat in a row. There had been files she wasn't permitted to read, and a silver-haired man seated in the front row, who hadn't spoken throughout the proceedings, but had looked at her once and then turned away. When it was over, she had stepped into the corridor and remained there for a long time, holding a sheet of paper, and understanding that what she had spent her entire youth earning had been taken from her in less than a morning. Delia opened the door and walked out. Half an hour later, Pete Lasco knocked on the study door and placed a suspiciously thin file on the desk. He said there was almost nothing. No social media, not a single photograph online, no active bank account in her name, only several old payroll accounts that had been closed. The address on her documents belonged to a boarding house on the west side of the city that charged by the week. There was a 4-year gap that no record could explain, with no reported employment, no taxes, and no long-term lease. Pete said ordinary people left ordinary traces, and a blank space this clean had usually been created deliberately. Emmett picked up the file, turned through the pages, then set it down. He asked whether Pete had found anything suggesting she was dangerous. Pete said no. Emmett asked whether he had found anything suggesting she had a motive. Pete said no to that as well, and that was precisely what made him uncomfortable. Emmett nodded. "Let her stay," he said. Pete looked slightly surprised but asked no questions. Emmett added that no one was to disturb her, that she should be allowed to continue doing her work, and then he turned off the desk lamp. After that night, no one told Delia that she was permitted to go up to the 3rd floor, but no one repeated the first of the 3 instructions Mrs. Doyle had once given her either, and so every afternoon she carried the tea upstairs. Mrs. Doyle didn't stop her. She merely stood in the kitchen and watched her go, wiping the same plate over and over even though it had been dry for a long time. The 3rd floor was colder than usual that day, and when Delia pushed open the door, she saw that one of the windows had been left open about the width of a hand, allowing the wind outside to move across the wooden floor. Nell sat with her back toward the doorway, as she always did, her feet resting on the wheelchair supports. The legs of her pants pulled slightly higher than usual because someone had recently helped her change clothes. Delia placed the tray on the table, and at the precise moment the draft passed between them, she saw it. The girl's left ankle contracted. Once. A movement so slight that anyone who hadn't spent years watching bodies refuse to obey the people who lived inside them would never have noticed. Delia froze, only for half a second, but in that half second, something inside her chest dropped and then leaped upward again. She lowered the teacup very slowly so her hand wouldn't tremble. Then she asked exactly one question, her voice as ordinary as if she were asking about the weather. "Do you feel cold here?" She tilted her chin slightly toward the outer side of Nell's left calf, where the draft had just passed. Nell turned her head and looked at her. The young woman studied Delia for a long time with the expression of someone deciding whether to answer. Then she opened her notebook, wrote something, and turned it around. The words on the page said that sometimes she did, but the doctor had told her it was only a phantom sensation, that the brain invented feelings in places where sensation no longer existed. Delia read the words. She nodded and said that yes, things like that did happen. Then she closed the window halfway, told Nell to drink the tea while it was still hot, and walked out. She went down the length of the corridor and descended the narrow staircase. But halfway down, she had to stop. She placed both hands on the railing and stood there. Her hands were trembling. She pressed her fingernails into the wood until the trembling stopped, then went down to the kitchen and washed the cup. The following weeks passed without anything significant enough to attract the attention of anyone in the house. Every afternoon, Delia went upstairs at the same hour to clean the third-floor corridor. She did her work, and she never touched Nell, never pushed her wheelchair, and never helped her reach anything. Each day, the teacup was placed a little farther away on the table, far enough that Nell had to lean to reach it. The vase on the windowsill gradually shifted beyond the comfortable reach of her favored hand, until touching it required her to turn her entire upper body. Nell said nothing about it, nor did she mention how the cup moved farther away every day. She simply reached for it, drank her tea, and returned to her notebook. One afternoon, while Delia was wiping the doorframe, Nell lightly tapped her pencil against the arm of her chair to call her attention, then turned the notebook around. The words on the page asked what kind of work Delia had done before. Delia read them, continued wiping, and said that she had once cared for her mother for many years, beginning while she was still in school. She said her mother had been confined to bed and had gradually lost one thing after another. First her voice, then her hands, then everything else, slowly, year after year. Delia had learned how to lift someone without causing pain, how to turn her during the night without waking her completely, and how to recognize a good day from a bad one the moment she opened the bedroom door. She said that even at the end, her mother had still been able to smile with her eyes, and that was what Delia remembered most. Nell wrote another question, asking what had happened afterward. Delia folded the cleaning cloth and said that her mother had died. Then she didn't say another word about herself. Pete Lasco arrived earlier than usual one morning at the beginning of December and waited in the corridor until Emmett called him inside. He placed 2 sheets of paper on the desk, keeping them separate rather than fastening them together, in the manner of someone who knew the 2 matters had no connection to one another, but had arrived on the same day. He said he had continued keeping a loose watch on the Maid's situation, not because he was searching for anything, but simply because he hadn't closed the file, and then something had surfaced. Emmett asked what it was. Pete said the woman had been making the same installment payment every month, always on the correct day, without missing once in 4 years, toward a hospital bill. Emmett asked whose hospital bill it was. Pete was silent for a beat, then said the bill bore the name of a 3-year-old boy named Sam, and that the account had been closed many years ago. He said nothing more, and there was no need, because the page contained everything, the name, the date, and a long column of small payments, continuing all the way to the bottom. Emmett picked up the paper. He didn't read every line. He only looked at the column of figures, the unbroken column running steadily down the page, and remained silent for a long time. The only sound in the room came from the clock on the bookshelf. Pete stood waiting for a question, an order, anything at all, but nothing came. Emmett didn't ask who the child had been to her. He didn't ask why someone continued paying a debt after everything it belonged to had ended. He didn't need to ask, because some things could be understood simply by looking at a column of numbers, and because he knew what it felt like to make a payment every month for something that would never return. He had been signing those ivory envelopes for years. He placed the paper face down on the desk and told Pete that the matter ended there. No one was to mention it again, not even to Mrs. Doyle. Pete nodded. Then he pushed the second sheet forward. He said this one wasn't important. He merely thought his employer should know, because it concerned the household's monthly expenses. Dr. Warren Ashby had submitted his voluntary retirement, effective in several months, and the hospital had begun gradually transferring his consultation files to other physicians. Pete said that if Emmett wanted to maintain his sister's monitoring arrangements, He should probably begin considering a replacement. Emmett nodded, told him to leave the paper there, and Pete walked out. Emmett remained alone in the room, and he didn't think about Dr. Ashby at all. He turned the first sheet over again. That afternoon, he went down to the kitchen for water and stopped in the doorway because he heard voices inside. The maid was standing at the sink, while Marla sat at the table preparing vegetables and had just asked her something about when she was younger. Emmett heard Delia reply that there had been a time when she would mix soapy water in a plastic cup and blow bubbles in the middle of the kitchen all afternoon. The bubbles floated upward, clung to the cabinets, then burst, leaving the floor soaking wet. A little boy kept chasing them without ever catching one. He would fall heavily onto the floor, get back up, and begin running again, laughing so loudly that the neighbors had to knock on the wall. Marla asked who the boy had been. A brief silence followed. Then Delia said it had been a long time ago, and asked whether Marla wanted her to wash the vegetables as well. Emmett stood in the corridor holding an empty glass, but he didn't enter. He turned and went back upstairs to his study. That evening, he opened the drawer, took out the paper with the column of figures, and looked at it once more. Then he folded it in half and placed it inside the deepest compartment, where he kept the things he had no intention of showing anyone. He didn't know why he was keeping it. He knew only that from that day forward, whenever he passed through the kitchen and saw that woman bending down to clean something, the long, unbroken column of numbers appeared inside his mind, and he felt troubled in a way he couldn't name. Delia stayed late that night because the dryer in the basement stopped halfway through its cycle, leaving an entire load of bedsheets soaking wet. Mrs. Doyle had gone home that afternoon to care for her grandchild, so Delia sat downstairs alone, wringing out each sheet by hand and hanging it on the line. The house had its own sounds at night, water moving through the pipes, wood contracting in the cold, and she had grown familiar enough with them that they no longer startled her. At nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, she heard something different. A dull thud, not loud, carrying down from above through the stairwell, followed by silence. She stopped what she was doing. She waited. No one called out. No bell rang. There was no sound of running feet. And it was the silence that followed that made her drop the sheet onto the floor and run. She raced up 2 flights of stairs, continued along the narrow corridor, and pushed open the last door without knocking. The wheelchair stood tilted beside the bed, one wheel still turning slowly. Nell lay on the wooden floor between the chair and the bed, her body twisted onto one side, one hand still gripping the edge of the mattress, half her face pressed against the floor, her breathing rapid. The young woman didn't cry out. She looked toward the doorway with her eyes wide open and made no sound, in the manner of someone who had fallen many times in her life and had learned that calling for help changed nothing. Delia didn't summon anyone. She didn't run to find a telephone or shout down through the house. She stepped forward and knelt, and in that moment, something inside her awakened by itself, something that had been sleeping for many years, and her hands began working before her mind had time to think. In a low, steady voice, she told the young woman not to try lifting herself, to remain still for now and breathe out slowly. Delia slid one hand beneath Nell's knees, her palm cupping the outer side of the joint, securing the legs so they wouldn't rotate with the rest of the body. She placed her other hand behind Nell's neck, spreading her fingers beneath the base of the skull, her thumb resting gently against one side, holding the head and neck in a straight line with the back. Then she said, "I'm going to turn you over now, slowly. 1, 2. She turned her, moving Nell's entire body as one solid unit without allowing any part of it to twist. Nell lay on her back on the floor, breathing. And as she breathed, something happened that she couldn't control. Her body recognized it first, before her mind, before her memory, before any conscious thought. The hand behind her neck, its warmth, the way its fingers spread to cradle that exact place, the thumb pressing gently against the right side, and the steady voice above her, telling her to keep breathing out slowly. Her heart began pounding so violently that she had to clutch the front of her shirt. A cold shiver rose across her entire body from her shoulders downward. She knew this. She had known it before. She lay motionless beneath that hand and tried to remember where she knew it from, but her memory stood at the edge of something immense, dark and cold, and refused to cross. Delia knew nothing of what was happening inside her. She was tracing the young woman's spine with her fingertips, asking whether anything hurt and whether she felt any unusual numbness. Nell shook her head. Then Delia lifted her onto the bed, not by pulling her arms, but by sliding her own arms beneath Nell and transferring the weight across her hips in one clean, effortless movement, exactly like someone who had performed it several thousand times. She pulled up the blanket, placed a pillow beneath Nell's calves, then set the wheelchair upright, locked the brakes, and positioned it beside the bed at the precise angle where it should have been from the beginning. She was bending down to retrieve a slipper that had fallen beneath the bed when Nell spoke. The young woman's voice was still hoarse and quiet, but this time it was clearer than before. "You aren't someone who cleans floors." Delia straightened with the slipper in her hand. She looked at the young woman lying in the bed, staring directly at her. And for a moment, she intended to say something else. Then she placed the slipper at the foot of the bed, pulled the blanket a little higher, and said, "Tonight, I am." She turned off the main light, left the small lamp burning in the corner, and walked out. The following afternoon, Delia went up to the 3rd floor later than usual, and when she opened the door, she found the small table pulled into the center of the room. The notebook had been placed on it, already opened to a blank page, with the pencil resting across it. Nell sat beside the table facing the doorway, waiting. Her posture told Delia that this conversation had been prepared since morning. Delia set down the tray. Nell wrote one line and turned the notebook around. It said that the night before, Delia had helped her in a way no one else in the house ever had, and she wanted Delia to help her again. Delia read the words, then said no. She said that what she had done the previous night was something anyone who had cared for a sick person long enough would learn. It wasn't a profession, or any special skill. Nell needed a doctor, not someone who knew how to lift another person from the floor. Nell listened to everything, then wrote a second line. It said that she had already had doctors for 10 years. Delia shook her head and said no a second time, and this time, she spoke a little more honestly. She said she wasn't permitted to do it, that she had no documents, nothing that gave her the right to place her hands on Nell's body, and that if anything happened, it wouldn't be Nell who lost something. Nell would make Delia lose the last thing she had left. Nell looked at her for a long time after that, but she didn't ask what that last thing was. She only wrote a third line, asking what Delia was afraid of, and Delia, standing there with the cleaning cloth in her hand, said no for the 3rd time. This time, there were no reasons left for her to hide behind. She said she had done this before. She had once sat beside someone and done everything correctly, every step, every day, for many years. And that person had still faded away piece by piece until nothing remained. She said she didn't want to sit beside another person and watch that happen again. When she finished, she turned away and picked up the tray, intending to leave. Nell tapped her pencil twice against the tabletop. Delia stopped. The young woman began writing slowly, and this time, the letters were larger. Then she turned the notebook around. It said that for 10 years, everyone who entered this room had told her what she couldn't do, and not one of them had ever asked whether she could feel anything. Delia was the first person who had asked. Delia read the sentence. Then she read it again. The tray in her hands descended very slowly until it touched the table. She pulled out the chair across from Nell and sat down. For a while she said nothing and only looked at her own hands. Then she raised her eyes and said, "All right, but there are conditions." She said they would work for 40 minutes every day, no longer, and if Delia said stop, they would stop without argument. She said the things they would do would be so small that Nell would become desperately bored, so small that anyone looking in from outside would believe nothing was happening, and there would be many days when nothing truly happened at all. She said, "I'm not promising you anything. I won't tell you that you'll walk again. I don't know, and if anyone tells you that you will, don't believe them." Nell nodded after each condition. Then Delia stated the final one. Nell's brother couldn't know. Not now. Not the following week. Not until there was something truly worth telling him. She said that if he found out, Delia would leave the house that very night, and it would end there. Nell picked up her pencil but didn't write immediately. She sat looking down at the page for a long time. Then she wrote a brief sentence and turned the notebook around. It said that her brother couldn't know for one of Nell's own reasons either. Delia asked what that reason was. Nell continued writing, and this time, she didn't turn the notebook around. She pushed the entire notebook across the tabletop toward Delia. The words said, "I want to walk to him myself. I don't want to be carried to him." Delia read them. She placed one hand on the edge of the notebook, closed it, and pushed it back toward the young woman. Then she said, "All right. We begin tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But first, you're going to finish your lunch." The place they chose was the old bathroom at the end of the third-floor corridor, a room no one had used in a long time, with old ceramic tiles that provided good traction, a brass grab bar installed by the previous owner, and a door that could be closed. Delia brought up a wooden chair from the servants' dining room, 2 thick bath towels rolled tightly and secured with cloth ties, and an old seat cushion. That was everything. Only a few steps away, behind another door, stood the room filled with machinery imported from across the ocean, still covered with protective sheets, and still dusted every month. On the first day, all Nell had to do was sit on the wooden chair with both feet planted flat against the floor and practice breathing. Nothing more. 40 minutes. On the second day, Delia placed 1 rolled towel beneath the sole of Nell's left foot and told her to imagine pressing downward. She didn't need to press in reality. She only had to think about pressing, think about the place where her skin touched the towel, and hold that thought there. Nell managed approximately 15 minutes before throwing the towel into the corner of the room. She wrote in her notebook that this wasn't leading anywhere. Delia picked up the towel, returned it to its place, and said, "You did less today than you did yesterday. Tomorrow we'll do it again." She didn't say anything else. The second time came the following week, when Nell had been practicing for almost 2 weeks, without anything inside her changing, without one new sensation or anything she could hold on to. She shoved the wooden chair over onto the floor. Delia set it upright, brushed off her hands, and said, "You did less today than you did yesterday. Tomorrow we'll do it again." The third time, Nell didn't break anything. She merely turned her face toward the wall and refused to cooperate throughout the entire session. When the 40 minutes ended, Delia gathered the towels, folded them, placed them inside the cabinet, and said precisely the same words. There was no encouragement, no promise, no hand resting on her shoulder. And that was exactly why Nell returned to the old bathroom at 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Because for 10 years, everyone who entered her room had brought a voice overflowing with hope, and she had learned that those voices were always the first things to disappear. Then, on one December afternoon, Nell noticed something else. She realized that the gray sweater Delia was wearing was the same one she had worn the day before, with the same worn place on the right cuff and the same crease. By itself, that meant nothing. But when Delia bent down to adjust the rolled towel, Nell caught the scent clinging to the sweater, the cold, damp smell of outdoor air, the kind clothing carried only after spending an entire night outside, rather than inside a heated room. Nell didn't ask anything. She simply paid attention. She noticed that Delia had arrived earlier than usual that week, even earlier than Mrs. Doyle. She noticed that on one morning, Delia's hair was still wet even though it hadn't rained. She noticed that Delia no longer mentioned going home, and that the cloth bag she carried every day had become fuller than before. And she noticed the clearest thing of all, that no matter what was happening, the woman had never arrived even 1 minute late. That night, Nell lay in bed and assembled all those small details until they formed a shape. That shape was a homeless woman sleeping aboard the night bus that traveled in circles around the city because it was the warmest place a single fare could buy. Washing her face and changing her clothes in a public restroom at dawn, then walking to this house so she could arrive on time. Nell lay staring at the ceiling for a long while. She didn't write it down. She didn't tell Mrs. Doyle, didn't write to her brother, and didn't reveal a single word in her notebook, because she understood that if she said anything, the woman would disappear from this house before morning, perhaps from shame, perhaps for some reason Nell hadn't yet discovered. The next morning, Mrs. Doyle brought up her breakfast as she did every day: toast, eggs, 1 peeled orange, and a glass of warm milk. Nell ate the orange. Then she pushed the tray, holding everything else outside her bedroom door, placed it on the small table in the corridor where anyone passing by would see it, and wheeled herself back inside. By noon, the tray was completely empty. She did the same thing the next day, and the day after that. No one said anything about it, and neither woman mentioned it even once. It happened on an entirely ordinary afternoon near the end of their session, when they were both tired, and Nell had been sitting on the wooden chair long enough for her back to begin aching. Delia told her to close her eyes, not to meditate, but simply to remove one distraction so her eyes wouldn't interfere. Then she placed her palm over the top of Nell's right foot, pressed down gently, and told her not to think about the entire foot. She was to think only about the big toe, only that one place, and hold the thought there without allowing it to move. Nell breathed out slowly. Outside the window came the sound of a car passing along the wet street. Then her right big toe contracted. It curled inward slightly, slowly and awkwardly, then straightened. Delia didn't cry out in excitement. Her hand remained precisely where it was without moving even an inch, and in the same calm voice she used when speaking about the heating vent and the weather, she said, "Do it again." Nell opened her eyes. She looked down at her foot. Then she looked at Delia. Delia repeated, "Close your eyes. Do it again." Nell closed them. This time, it took longer. Nearly a minute passed without anything happening, and Delia didn't hurry her or say another word. She merely kept her hand in place. Then the big toe contracted a second time, more clearly than the first. Delia nodded once and said, "Yes." That was all. She said yes, then added that they would stop there for the day and continue tomorrow. She removed her hand and turned away to retrieve the rolled towel from the corner of the room so she could put it inside the cabinet. Behind her, Nell Castellano began to cry. The young woman cried without making a sound, her shoulders trembling, both hands gripping the edges of the wooden chair, tears running down her chin and falling onto the front of her blouse as she lowered her head to hide her face. She hadn't cried in front of another person for 10 years. She had cried many times at night beneath the blankets, where no one could see her, but never here. Never at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Never in the middle of a room with another person standing nearby. Delia didn't turn around immediately. She folded the towel, placed it inside the cabinet, closed the door, and allowed the young woman a little more time. Then she came over and knelt beside the chair. She didn't embrace her, didn't stroke her comfortingly, and didn't tell her everything was all right. She merely placed her hand over the back of Nell's hand where it gripped the edge of the chair, and kept it there until the young woman's shoulders stopped trembling. Afterward, she took Nell back to her bedroom, covered her with a blanket, positioned the wheelchair at the proper angle, then walked out and closed the door. That evening, after everyone else had gone downstairs, Delia remained on the 3rd floor to organize the large storage cabinet at the end of the corridor, as Mrs. Doyle had instructed her the week before. In the lowest compartment, behind several stacks of bedsheets no one ever used, her hand touched a stiff cardboard box. She pulled it out. It was a shoebox from a proper shoe store rather than a supermarket, its 4 edges still sharp and its lid intact. A layer of dust covered the top so thickly that when she placed one finger against it, the touch left a distinct line. The ribbon tied around the box remained knotted and had never been undone. Delia opened the lid. Inside was a pair of pristine white sneakers, bought with room to grow just before that tragic night. The soles were completely intact, without a single scratch, though the tissue paper wrapped around them had yellowed with age. She looked at the shoes for a while. She didn't pick them up. She didn't turn them over to examine the soles, search for a receipt, or wonder why a pair of shoes that had never been worn had remained inside a linen cabinet for so many years. There were things in this house she had grown accustomed to leaving unquestioned, and she had lived long enough to know that most of the best questions were the ones people chose not to ask. She replaced the lid, used the edge of her apron to wipe the dust from the box, then carried it toward the end of the corridor. She opened the bedroom door slightly. Nell was asleep with her face turned toward the wall, her breathing steady. Delia stepped inside very quietly, bent down, and pushed the box beneath the bed near the headboard, where Nell could reach it simply by lowering one hand. Then she walked out, closed the door, and told no one what she had done. The bus stop stood at the corner of Hope Street beneath a transparent plastic shelter that had yellowed with age, with an iron bench that felt bitterly cold at that hour. Delia stood there on Friday night, clutching her cloth bag against her chest as she waited for the bus that traveled the overnight loop. She heard someone's shoes approaching, then stopping several steps away, and when she turned, she saw a middle-aged man with neatly combed silver hair, wearing a dark wool coat and holding an umbrella even though it wasn't raining. He greeted her by name. Delia didn't answer. He said he had been passing by and recognized her, that he was very pleased to see she still appeared well, and his voice genuinely sounded like that of someone who truly was pleased. He asked whether she was all right, how her living arrangements were, and how her work was going, one question at a time, slowly and patiently, in precisely the voice of a doctor who had spent his life sitting across from frightened people and had learned how to calm them. Delia said she was fine. He nodded, looked down at the wet pavement for a while, then said he had heard something about her working for a family on the east side of the city. She said nothing. He told her that the city was small, and sooner or later, everything reached someone's ears. Then he released a breath and said what he had come there to say, speaking in the voice of a man who was sincerely concerned for her. He said he was only afraid that she was once again doing the very thing that had destroyed her the first time. He said she had always possessed a good heart, and he had never doubted that. But a good heart was the most dangerous thing anyone could carry in this profession, because it made people promise things the human body couldn't promise. He said that when someone planted hope inside a family, it wasn't planted in only one person. It was planted in all of them. And that hope grew very quickly, more quickly than any possible progress could keep pace with. Then one day, it failed to come true. And when it failed, people didn't search for a reason. They searched for someone to blame, because blame was far easier to live with than acceptance. He paused, then continued, saying that the last time, all they had taken from her was a piece of paper. He sincerely hoped that this time, she wouldn't allow herself to end up in a place where they could take far more than that. He didn't speak the words harshly or emphasize a single part of them. He delivered them in the same way someone might remind another person to wear a warmer coat because the weather was about to turn cold. Delia remained still. She didn't argue. She didn't say that he understood nothing, that this was different, or that she was being much more careful this time. She stood there and allowed every sentence to fall into her because the most frightening thing was that everything he had said was true. She had thought those same things to herself during many nights, while the bus traveled across the bridge and the entire city lay dark beyond the windows. There wasn't one sentence among them that she hadn't already spoken inside her own mind. He looked at her, then at his watch, and added one more thing, as though he had only just remembered it. He said that fortunately, he would be retiring completely in several months. All the paperwork had been submitted, and the hospital was gradually transferring his responsibilities. He said that, in truth, this would be better for everyone because when someone left the profession, old matters closed behind him. No one wanted to dig them up again, and no board would gather to review records from another lifetime over and over. Sometimes, he said, time was the kindest thing people were given. Then he wished her a pleasant evening, told her to keep warm, and walked away. The bus rolled toward the stop. Its doors opened, and the warmth inside washed over her face. Delia climbed aboard, handed over her ticket, and took her usual place in the final row. She stared through the window throughout the entire first circuit and didn't close her eyes once. That weekend, Delia gathered enough money to rent a small room again on the west side of the city, a converted basement space with a tiny window near the ceiling and a single electric burner. She moved into it with her cloth bag and one cardboard box containing everything she still possessed in the world. On Tuesday night, she returned after her shift and found the door slightly open. Inside, the drawers had been pulled out, the mattress overturned, and her clothes thrown across the floor. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then entered and began checking. The envelope containing that week's wages remained untouched inside the rice container. Her old telephone was still on the table. Her mother's watch was still inside the drawer, where anyone searching the room would have found it first. She walked around the room once more, this time more slowly, and then she understood what was missing. The square cardboard box she always kept beneath the bed was gone. It had contained the document bearing the board's decision, the certificate that had been revoked but which she had kept, even though it was now worthless, and one photograph. Only one photograph. She sat down on the cold floor with her back against the side of the bed, surrounded by her scattered clothes, and she didn't cry aloud. She remained there for a very long time, with both hands resting in her lap, her eyes open and fixed on the empty wall before her, while her entire body seemed to fold inward little by little until she became nothing more than a small, motionless shape in the middle of the ransacked room. Delia had lost many things in her life, and she had risen after every one of those losses, but there was a limit to how much could be taken from a human being, and that night, she reached it. The next morning, she still arrived on time. She still cleaned the first floor, still went up to the third floor at 4 o'clock, and still told Nell, "You did less today than you did yesterday. Tomorrow, we'll do it again." But Pete Lasco, who maintained the habit of loosely monitoring everything involving the people in the household, learned what had happened before Mrs. Doyle did. He went to the study and reported exactly what he knew. Delia's room had been searched. No money had been taken. Nothing of monetary value was missing. The only thing stolen was a cardboard box containing old papers and a photograph. Pete added that this wasn't a burglary. A burglar took money. Whoever had done this wanted to send a message. Emmett listened in silence. Then he opened the right drawer of his desk and removed a small leather notebook with worn corners. The notebook Pete had seen on that desk for years and knew contained certain names. Emmett opened it and picked up his pen. He remained that way for several seconds. Then he closed the notebook, set it down, pushed it aside, and said, "I'll handle this myself." Pete didn't ask any questions. He merely stepped outside and sat on the bench in the corridor, because that was his duty on nights like this. He had sat there many times before, and he knew this night would be long. From where he sat, he heard the telephone in the study ring, then stop, then ring again. He heard a car door close in the courtyard once, then heard it again much later. He saw the light still burning at 2 o'clock, and again at 3. The next morning, while driving through the west side on other business, Pete noticed that 2 pawn shops along that stretch of road had opened unusually early. Inside both, people were rearranging shelves as though they had spent the entire night without sleep. He didn't ask anyone what had happened. He never asked. That morning, Delia entered the servants' dining room and found a square cardboard box on the table. She stopped in the doorway. Then she approached and lifted the lid. Inside was the board's decision, folded along the same old creases. Her certificate was there, undamaged. And there was the photograph, except it was no longer lying loose. Someone had placed it inside a small wooden frame with glass polished perfectly clean, a simple frame without decoration, made to fit it exactly. Delia stood there for a very long time holding the frame in both hands. Emmett passed the dining room doorway on his way to the car, carrying his coat. He didn't stop, didn't look inside, and didn't say a word. Delia didn't call after him. She didn't ask what he had done during the night, how he had done it, or who had been involved. She returned the frame to the box, replaced the lid, held it against her chest for a while, then placed it inside the servant's locker and went to retrieve her cleaning cloth. After the day her toe moved, Nell changed. She began practicing alone in the mornings before anyone else in the house was awake, and she kept it secret. Delia knew. She had told Nell to stop, had explained that her body needed more time to rest than to work, and that what they were doing wasn't a race against anyone. Nell nodded and continued practicing. She had waited 10 years, and now she could see a door standing slightly open. There was no argument in the world that could make someone in her position remain still. On Thursday afternoon, near the end of their session, she demanded to repeat the sequence one more time. Delia said no. Their time was over. Nell tapped her pencil twice against the table and wrote in large letters that she wanted only one more attempt. Delia looked at the words, then at the young woman's face, and gave in. It was the only thing in this entire story that she would never forgive herself for afterward. In the middle of that additional attempt, the color drained from Nell's face. She said her head hurt. Delia removed her hands immediately and helped her lean backward. She saw cold beads of sweat forming across the young woman's forehead even though the room wasn't warm. Delia knew this. She knew exactly what it was and how dangerous it could be for someone with a spinal cord injury. She elevated Nell's head, loosened her collar, immediately removed the cloth straps wrapped around her calves, and shouted down through the house for Mrs. Doyle in a voice no one there had ever heard her use. The ambulance arrived in less than 10 minutes. 2 paramedics came up to the 3rd floor, measured Nell's blood pressure, and read the number aloud to each other. The older one asked who had placed her in that position. Delia said she had. He nodded once and said she had done the right thing. They transferred Nell onto the stretcher, secured her, and began carrying her downstairs. Emmett arrived home just as the stretcher reached the 2nd floor landing. He didn't ask anyone a single question. He went directly to his sister, his face white. Immediately behind him came Pete Lasco, carrying a file he had held since that afternoon, something it had taken him weeks to extract from the archived records of the state licensing board. He had intended to wait until evening before presenting it. Now he didn't wait. He placed it in his employer's hand. Emmett looked down. The first page was an extract of the board's decision. Delia Whitlock's name appeared on it. It stated that her professional license had been revoked, and immediately beneath that, printed clearly in the dry language of administrative documents, was the reason. This person had engaged in conduct that endangered a patient. He read the sentence. Then he looked up at his sister lying on the stretcher, her face still pale, her hair damp with sweat at the temples, while the 2 paramedics held either end. He didn't need anyone to explain anything further. He had read exactly what he held in his hand, and any brother in the world would have connected those 2 things exactly as he just had. Delia stood at the head of the staircase, still holding the towel. Emmett turned toward her. He didn't shout. His voice was lower than usual, and that was what made the entire corridor turn cold. "Get out of my house," he said. "Now." Delia didn't argue a single word. It wasn't because she had nothing to say, but because she saw his face and knew that anything she said in that moment would be nothing but noise. She placed the towel on the railing. Then Nell opened her eyes on the stretcher. She raised one hand slowly and weakly and managed to grasp the edge of her brother's sleeve, holding it tightly. Her voice was hoarse and broken, but loud enough for everyone in the corridor to hear. "Don't," she said. Emmett became completely still. He looked down at his sister's hand gripping his sleeve. In 10 years, this was only the 3rd time she had spoken, and he had heard only 2 of those times. Something cracked inside his chest, and he had to swallow it down. But he still held the file in his other hand, and he didn't withdraw what he had said. He placed his hand over his sister's, gently removed it from his sleeve, lowered it, and told the 2 paramedics to go. The stretcher disappeared down the stairs. Delia entered the servant's room, removed her apron, folded it, and placed it over the back of the chair exactly as she had done the first time. She took her cloth bag and the cardboard box from the locker. "Mrs." Doyle stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands clasped together, and she opened her mouth as if to say something. No words came. Delia left through the side door and walked out to the sidewalk. And that night, the city felt colder than it ever had before. Nell returned home after 2 nights in the hospital, and the doctor on duty said that all her readings were stable, that this sometimes happened, and that she only needed to be monitored for several more days. Emmett listened to everything, thanked him, and took his sister home. From that day forward, the room at the end of the 3rd-floor corridor returned to exactly what it had been for 10 years. Nell stopped writing. She didn't push her notebook toward anyone to be read, didn't tap her pencil against the table to call for attention, and didn't look at anyone for longer than a second. "Mrs." Doyle carried the trays upstairs and brought them back down, and every meal returned untouched. Emmett entered his sister's room each evening, sat in the chair beside the window, and said a few things about the weather, about work, and about how he would find someone else, someone properly qualified and kind. Nell stared through the window and never turned around. One night, he sat there for nearly an hour without speaking. When he finally rose to leave, he heard the scrape of pencil against paper behind him. He knew she was drawing, but he didn't dare turn around to see what. On Saturday morning, Mrs. Doyle went up to the 3rd floor with breakfast and discovered that the room was empty. The blanket had been folded neatly, the wheelchair was gone, the window was closed, and the lights were off. She ran downstairs and called out, and within 10 minutes, the entire house had been thrown into chaos. Someone searched the basement, someone else went into the back garden. Pete called the 2 men stationed at the gate, while Emmett stood in the middle of the living room holding his telephone without knowing whom to call first, because in 10 years, there had never been a single occasion when his sister had left that house without someone pushing her chair. Mrs. Doyle was the first to notice a detail. She said the young mistress's small wallet was no longer inside the drawer. Then the gatekeeper said that early that morning, a taxi had stopped outside on the street. The driver had climbed out and opened the trunk to remove something, but the gatekeeper had assumed the car belonged to the neighboring house. Emmett got into his car. He drove himself without waiting for Pete. For the first several minutes, he didn't know where he was going. He merely circled the streets surrounding the house. Then he stopped in the middle of the road, turned off the engine, and thought. He thought about the route around which everything in that house had revolved for the past several months. The route he had never once considered. He opened his telephone, searched for the overnight bus loop through the west side, and looked at every place where it stopped. Then he started the engine. He found his sister at the bus stop on the corner of Hope Street. She sat in her wheelchair beneath the yellowed plastic shelter, wearing a heavy coat and a scarf, with a wool blanket from her room covering her legs and her notebook resting in her lap. Beside her on the iron bench stood a paper cup of coffee that was still steaming, probably given to her by the newspaper vendor at the end of the block. She wasn't trembling. She sat with her back straight and her eyes fixed on the far end of the street, in the posture of someone who was waiting and knew precisely whom she was waiting for. Emmett parked the car, opened the door, and walked toward her. For one moment, he couldn't speak. He lowered himself onto one knee beside the wheelchair and asked what she was doing there. Nell turned to look at him. Then she spoke. Her voice was still hoarse and still required a moment before the words emerged. But this time, she spoke an entire sentence. She said it slowly and clearly, one word at a time, like someone who had arranged it inside her mind throughout several sleepless nights. "I've waited 10 years, Emmett. I can't wait any longer." Emmett looked at his sister. He looked at the cup of coffee on the bench, the small wallet inside her coat pocket, the blanket she had retrieved herself, and the way she had calculated that she needed to call the taxi before 6 o'clock to reach the final circuit. She had done everything herself. She had made the decision, paid the fare, and left the house he had always believed he was protecting her inside. And he suddenly understood that for 10 years, he had taken care of everything for his sister except the one thing that mattered, asking what she wanted. He sat on the iron bench beside her. The morning was cold, and the street was empty. He asked whether she was certain Delia would pass that way. Nell said she wasn't. Then she added that if he sat there too, they could watch both directions of the street. And he stayed. It took Pete Lasco nearly a week to dig deeper, and when he returned to the study, he didn't place the papers on the desk. He kept them in his hands because this time, he wanted to speak before his employer had a chance to read. He said the sentence they had seen before was real. It appeared exactly that way in the record, but it was only the final conclusion, not the entire story. He said the woman had been brought before the board after reporting something that had occurred inside the very treatment center where she worked. Certain therapy records listed more sessions than had actually taken place, so the facility could bill the insurance company. Several weeks after she filed her complaint, one patient's record was brought forward. Its dates had been altered, and she became the person required to explain herself. Pete said 3 former colleagues had been called to testify, and 2 of them withdrew their statements before the hearing. Emmett asked who had served on the board that day. Pete handed him the list. Emmett looked down, and near the bottom of the page, under the section for professional advisors, there was the name of a man to whom he had been writing checks for 10 years. He remained silent for a long time. Then he said, "Find her for me." Delia was working the afternoon shift at the Warwick Hotel, waiting tables through a position she had obtained, and Emmett waited for her at the employee exit. She came outside, still wearing her uniform, and stopped when she saw him. He didn't speak in circles. He said he had been wrong. He said the document he had seen that day was genuine, but the story behind it wasn't, and he had thrown her out of his house in the middle of the night without asking a single further question. Then he removed a signed check from the inside pocket of his coat and held it toward her. He didn't do it to buy her. He did it because throughout his life, he had never learned another way to tell someone that he owed them, and money was the only language he spoke fluently. Delia looked at the check. She didn't take it. "Thank you, sir, but I can't accept that." He told her to take it, that it wasn't payment for forgiveness, but something she should have received long ago. She shook her head. Then she said something he would think about many times afterward. "If I take this, I become someone you hired. And you've been hiring people for 10 years, sir, one after another. Every one of them was skilled. Every one of them was expensive. Not one of them was willing to sit on the floor with that girl." Emmett stood there, holding the check, unable to answer. He folded it, returned it to his pocket, then asked what she wanted. Delia said she would return, but on her own terms. She would come in the afternoons for 40 minutes, exactly as before, and she wouldn't accept a single dollar. She wouldn't return to that house as a maid. She wouldn't clean the floors, do the laundry, or remain for meals, and she would keep her shift at the hotel so she could provide for herself. She said she needed it that way because if she ate at his table, she would become one of his people again, and what Nell needed wasn't another one of his people. Emmett studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He asked whether she needed him to do anything. "Yes," she said. "Don't enter that room during those 40 minutes." That evening, attorney Miriam Sloan came to the study at his request, read the entire file Pete had provided, and set it down with the expression of someone who had just seen something she didn't like. She said that if the information inside was true, then this wasn't merely the case of one person unjustly stripped of her license. It involved an entire series of records that might have been altered over many years. Then she told him the most important part. The board's authority applied only to people who were still practicing, and once someone officially retired, the file would be closed. No review hearing would be opened, and everything lying on that desk would become a useless stack of paper. She asked when Ashby had submitted his retirement. Emmett said at the beginning of December. Miriam Sloan looked at him and said, "Then we don't have much time." Delia told no one what she was about to do. She didn't tell Emmett, didn't tell the attorney, and didn't even tell Nell. She began with a name she had spent 4 years trying to forget. A woman named Rhonda Pike, who had once worked as an imaging technician at the Bayline Center, who had sat with Delia in the break room through many lunch hours, and who had also been one of the people who withdrew her testimony before the hearing. Delia obtained the telephone number through a mutual acquaintance. Rhonda didn't answer the first call or the second. On the fourth, she picked up, and the first thing she said was, "Don't call me again." Delia said she needed only one thing, an old imaging record taken 10 years earlier of a 9-year-old child who had been brought in after an accident. Rhonda gave a short laugh and asked whether Delia understood what she was requesting. Then she said she had a husband, 2 children still in school, and a job she needed to keep. 4 years earlier, she had been so afraid that she couldn't look Delia in the face in the corridor, and she was still just as afraid now. Delia didn't blame her for any of it. She only asked whether the record still existed. Rhonda remained silent for a long time, then said it did. Everything from before the center changed to its new system had been copied and stored in the basement archives, and she knew where it was. Then she stated her condition. If this came to light, and anyone traced it back to her, she would say she had known nothing about it, that Delia had stolen the documents herself, and she needed something in writing to protect her. Delia asked what she wanted. Rhonda said she wanted a handwritten and signed declaration in which Delia admitted taking the documents without authorization, and promised that if the matter was discovered, she would never apply to have her professional license reinstated, not for the rest of her life. Rhonda said plainly that this was the only way she could trust her, because as long as Delia still hoped to recover her credentials, she would have a reason to betray Rhonda in exchange for leniency. Once Delia had signed away that possibility, she would have nothing left to bargain with. Delia stood inside a public telephone booth on the corner with the receiver pressed to her ear, looking through the glass clouded with condensation. She thought about the certificate inside the cardboard box beneath her bed, a dead document she had preserved for 4 years only because it was the sole proof that she had once been someone. She thought about how she still possessed the right to apply for another review, a right she had never exercised and had kept in reserve like a small lamp she could continue looking toward. Then she thought about a 19-year-old woman sitting on a wooden chair inside an old bathroom and asking what Delia was afraid of. "All right," she said. They met in the parking lot behind a supermarket on Tuesday night. Delia wrote the declaration by hand on the hood of Rhonda's car beneath the streetlight, her letters slow and straight, without a single trembling stroke. She signed her name and added the date. Rhonda read it twice, folded the page, placed it inside her coat pocket, then removed a large brown envelope from the car and handed it over. She didn't say goodbye. She climbed into the car and left. Delia sat on the concrete steps behind the supermarket and opened the envelope beneath the light. Inside were copies of a series of imaging films, the accompanying interpretation report, and a typed clinical summary. She turned to the description of the injury. She read it, then read it again. In the original report, the damage to that section of the spinal cord had been clearly documented as incomplete, which meant the neural pathways hadn't been severed entirely, which meant some signals could still pass through, which meant everything that family had been told for 10 years had been built upon a false foundation. But on the final summary page, the only page an ordinary family would have read, the injury had been recorded as complete. Delia turned to the lower right corner of that page, where the supervising physician's signature belonged. She remained on the cold concrete step for a very long time, with the document in her hands. The signature belonged to Warren Ashby. Delia brought the envelope the following afternoon, intending to hand it directly to Emmett. But when she reached the 3rd floor, Nell was already sitting on the wooden chair inside the old bathroom, with her notebook open across her lap, the page covered in writing. The young woman didn't wait for Delia to put down her bag. She turned the notebook around, then spoke aloud instead of writing. "I want to tell you something, and I'll tell it only once." Delia sat on the tiled floor with her back against the wall and listened. Nell said that when she was 9 years old, on a winter night, her father's car overturned on a bridge. She remembered the wind, the sound of it whistling through the broken glass, and she remembered that everything was dark, so dark that she couldn't tell whether she was lying on her side or on her back. Her father was in the front seat, and he no longer answered her. She had called for him several times, then stopped. A very long time passed before anyone came. Then she heard someone crawling inside through the broken glass. That person didn't pull her out, didn't shake her, and didn't try to move her at all. The person merely slid 2 hands around her neck, held her head perfectly still, and kept talking to her until blue and red lights began flashing outside. The voice kept counting endlessly, backward and then forward, telling her to count along and warning her not to fall asleep. Nell said she had never seen the person's face. Her entire memory of that night contained only darkness, a voice counting numbers, and 2 hands. Nell stopped. Then she continued very slowly. For 10 years, she had tried to remember those hands, and she had drawn them over and over because she was afraid that if she stopped drawing, she would forget them. And if she forgot, there would be nothing left to prove that someone had been there with her that night. She remembered exactly one detail. The little finger on the left hand wasn't straight. It curved upward. Delia didn't move. She sat with her back against the tiled wall of the old bathroom and felt all the blood drain from her body, because she remembered that night. She remembered it more clearly than any other night of her life. She had been 17, walking home after a part-time shift, and she had climbed over the bridge railing and crawled through the broken glass because no one else was there. She had held a child's head between both hands for more than 20 minutes until the rescue vehicles arrived. Then she had moved back and stood close against the bridge railing so the responders could work, watching as the ambulance drove away. Her left hand had been injured while she climbed through the broken glass. It later healed incorrectly, and her little finger had never straightened again. She had gone on to train in that profession because of that night. But throughout the following 10 years, the one thing she had never learned, the question she had carried through every class, every shift, and every hearing, was what had happened to that child afterward, whether she had survived, and what her name was. Delia raised her eyes to the young woman sitting on the wooden chair. She managed only 3 words. "Was that you?" Nell nodded. Then she told Delia the rest, the part she had never told anyone. While she was in the hospital, on the 3rd or perhaps the 4th night, she awakened and heard people talking in the corridor. She recognized her brother's voice. He had been only 24 at the time, and he kept asking the same question again and again while 2 men answered him. Nell said she had been too young to understand all the words they used, but she understood one thing very clearly. What they told her brother wasn't the same as what they had been saying to each other moments earlier. I lay there knowing they were lying to him, but I was 9 years old, and there was nothing I could do. Then I thought that if no one in that house would tell the truth, I wouldn't speak either. At first, I intended to remain silent for only a few days. Then it became several months. Then it had lasted so long that I no longer knew where to begin if I opened my mouth. She looked at Delia and spoke her final sentence. "For 10 years, you're the first person who has entered that house and told me something true." That evening, Nell asked Delia to help carry a stack of sketchbooks down to the study, and she placed all of them on the desk before her brother, dozens of books arranged in 3 piles. Emmett looked at them and said he had seen them already, that her drawings were beautiful. Nell told him he hadn't seen them. Then she reached for the book on top, turned through the pages filled with drawings of hands, and stopped near the middle, where the paper felt slightly thicker. From between 2 pages, she removed a sheet folded into quarters. It was a handwritten copy of a consultation invoice, bearing a date, an amount, and a signature in the corner. She continued turning the pages and removed a second sheet, then a third. She said that for 10 years, she had sat at the top of the staircase every time the doctor visited, and she had recorded everything. She recorded the date he arrived, how long he remained in the room, what examinations he performed, and what he told Emmett when he left. Some months, he hadn't come at all, but the envelope had still arrived. Nell said she didn't know what any of it was for. She only knew she had to record it because no one else in that house kept records. Emmett sat down. He opened each sketchbook, and among all the hands drawn in pencil, he discovered an entire system created by a 9-year-old child and maintained by a 19-year-old woman throughout 10 long years, something no one else in that house had ever thought to do. He called Miriam Sloan that same night. 3 days later, while comparing the stack of sketchbooks with the archived records Pete had obtained from the licensing board, the attorney discovered something else. There was a professional character statement submitted to the board 4 years earlier, in the name of someone willing to testify to Delia Whitlock's professional integrity, and beside it was another form filed 3 days later, requesting its withdrawal. Both documents bore the signature of Orla Doyle. Emmett called her into the study. She stood there with her hands clasped together and didn't deny anything. She said she had been the head nurse at that center for many years before coming to work for this family. She knew Delia hadn't done anything wrong. She had known from the beginning because she was the person who prepared the duty schedules. And she knew Delia hadn't even been present that day. Mrs. Doyle said she had filed the statement. Then, someone had called her, and very kindly explained that if the matter were brought forward, people would review all the records she herself had signed. and she had 2 children who were still in school. She withdrew the statement. 4 years later, she saw Delia's name on a list of people looking for work and brought her into this house. She told herself that was enough, that she had repaid at least part of what she owed. "I had 4 months to tell you, Master Emmett," she said. "And I didn't," Emmett asked who had called her that day. "Mrs. Doyle said she didn't know the person's name, but whoever it was had known that she worked for this family." Emmett remained seated for a long time after she left. Then he opened the file, turned to the list of everyone who had served on the board, and compared the dates against his sister's sketchbooks. He worked throughout the night. Near morning, he called a man at the bank who had served the family since his father's time and asked only one question about the monthly payments that had passed through the household account during the past 10 years, and how those funds had been divided after leaving it. The following afternoon, he summoned Gus Barone. The old man arrived, removed his hat, and sat in the chair he had occupied 1,000 times inside that room. Emmett placed the stack of papers on the desk between them and didn't say a word. Gus looked at it. He didn't pick it up. He released a breath and began speaking slowly, like a man who had rehearsed the words inside his mind for 10 years. He said he was the person who had recommended that doctor. He was the one who told Emmett not to ask anyone else, not to allow a family matter to leave the house, and every time Emmett considered finding another physician, Gus had found a reason to prevent it. He said yes, he had accepted money. Then he stopped and delivered the rest in a breaking voice. On the night of the accident, he had been the one who told Emmett's father to take the bridge. He had only wanted him to avoid a meeting in the district on the other side, nothing more. From that day forward, he hadn't dared allow anyone to reopen anything connected with that night, not even the girl's medical records, because if one thing were uncovered, another would follow. Emmett looked at him. Then he asked, "Did you ever watch her practice walking, Uncle Gus?" "Even once?" Gus Barone sat there and couldn't answer. That evening, Sal Marchetti came to the house, heard everything, then said, "Let me take care of that doctor. It'll be clean. No one will trace it back." Emmett said no. If this house knows only one way to solve things, then that girl will grow up inside a house that knows only one way. Then he called Miriam Sloan and told her to prepare the case file. That night, he went to Sal's restaurant alone, without bringing anyone. He sat down and pushed across the table the legal transfer documents for 2 southern warehouses, already bearing his signature. "You wanted your share, Uncle Sal? Here it is. From now on, you have no reason to enter my house again." Sal studied the documents for a long time. Then he took out his pen. Delia didn't know that afternoon's luncheon belonged to the Castellano family until she began her shift and saw the seating chart posted on the kitchen wall. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she went to collect her tray and did her work, because this was where she earned her living, and she had no right to choose who sat in the room beyond those doors. The Warwick Hotel kitchen was separated from the banquet hall by 2 swinging doors with round windows at eye level, and throughout the morning, Delia simply moved in and out through them, carrying trays, clearing plates, and pouring water without raising her eyes. Near the end of the meal, after all the desserts had been served and only scattered conversation remained in the room, she waited behind one of the swinging doors with a tray of clean glasses and looked through the round window. The wheelchair stood at the head of the long table on the right, near the aisle. Nell was sitting there with both hands in her lap. Delia saw it immediately. She saw that the young woman had removed her right foot from the support and placed it flat against the stone floor. Her left foot was positioned the same way. She saw Nell move forward toward the edge of the seat in precisely the manner they had practiced during so many afternoons inside the old bathroom, both hands resting on the arms of the chair, her elbows pressed against her sides. Delia knew exactly what was about to happen. Nell raised her head and looked directly across the room, past the people who were eating, toward the round window in the kitchen door, and found Delia there. Delia shook her head. She shook it clearly twice and formed the word no with her lips. Nell looked at her. Then the young woman released her hands from the arms of the chair. Delia placed the tray of glasses on the nearby service table, so hard that several glasses tipped against one another, and she pushed through the swinging door. She had no time to think about the fact that she was wearing a server's uniform. She had no time to think about the more than 80 people in the room, that some of them were people an entire city treated with caution, or that only several weeks earlier, she had been thrown out of the home belonging to the very people seated there in the middle of the night. She only walked out, then began to run. Over the final distance, she dropped to her knees on the stone floor. both knees sliding across the polished surface, her arms reaching forward. She knew she wouldn't reach Nell in time if the young woman had fallen on the second step. She still knelt there because, in that moment, it was the only place in the world where she wanted to be. She couldn't see the rest of the room. She didn't hear anyone cry out, didn't hear chairs being pushed back, and didn't see anyone rise. Her entire world contained only the cold stone beneath her knees, and a young woman walking toward her, slowly and unevenly, her body leaning toward the right, both arms extended for balance. Her face tightened with effort even as she smiled. Then that weight fell into Delia's arms. Delia held her, wrapping both arms around her back, one hand supporting the base of her neck through a habit that had become instinct. She sank onto the stone floor with the young woman in her lap. They were both breathing hard, and neither of them could speak. Only then did the noise of the room come rushing back around Delia. She looked up. At the first table, Gus Barone had risen abruptly from his chair, his entire body trembling. Then he collapsed back into his seat, raised both hands to cover his face, and remained that way without moving while everyone around him stood. Emmett was no longer where he had been standing. At some point, he had walked around the head of the table, and now he stopped about 3 steps away from the 2 women. He didn't come any closer. He only stood there watching his sister embrace a woman in a hotel employee's uniform in the middle of the banquet room floor, and he didn't approach because he understood that the moment didn't belong to him. He had learned, too late, that sometimes the kindest thing a person could do was remain still. The story should have ended there, but among the more than 80 people present, at least 3 had raised their telephones before the young woman took her second step. By afternoon, a video lasting less than a minute had been posted online, though no one knew who had uploaded it first. By evening, the local newspaper was running it on its website. Before 7 o'clock the following morning, Miriam Sloan called Emmett and said she had just received a notice from the board. Dr. Warren Ashby had filed a request to move his retirement date forward. Then she said, "Listen to me carefully. We don't have several months anymore. We have exactly 11 days." The hearing opened on a morning near the end of January, inside a modest conference room in the State Administrative Building, where 7 chairs were arranged in a row on the raised platform, and several rows below were reserved for those attending. Warren Ashby sat in the front row with his wool coat draped across his lap and his hands clasped together, in precisely the same place where he had sat 4 years earlier. Miriam Sloan presented the evidence in the order she had prepared. A copy of the original imaging report, with the injury documented as incomplete, the clinical summary that described it as complete, and the signature in the lower right corner. Then she placed the stack of sketchbooks on the table and explained that the handwritten figures between the drawings matched, date by date, the payment records her team had examined. One board member asked who had created those records. Miriam Sloan said that person was waiting in the corridor. The door opened. Nell Castellano walked inside without a wheelchair, without crutches, and without anyone supporting her. She moved slowly, her body leaning slightly toward the right, and every step visibly carried a price. The room was so quiet that everyone could hear the soles of her shoes touching the floor. 12 steps separated the doorway from the witness chair. She sat down, drew a breath, and spoke into the microphone in a voice that was still hoarse. "For 10 years, people told me I was an impossible case. I believed them because I was a child, and because everyone who entered my room said the same thing. Not one of them ever asked whether I could feel anything," she asked, and that was the entire difference. In the row of seats to the side, Emmett listened to his sister speak, and then he looked down. He looked at the white shoes on her feet, the soft leather sneakers with soles that had never been worn away, and he recognized them. He remembered the box, the ribbon, and the afternoon he had brought them home, bought a size larger for her growing feet just before her 9th birthday, right before the night on the bridge, before everything. He remembered pushing that box into the lowest cabinet after hearing the diagnosis, believing she would never grow into them. He remembered that for 10 years, he had never thrown it away, but had never once possessed the courage to open it. He turned his face toward the window and remained that way for a long time. The board voted to revoke Warren Ashby's medical license and referred the entire file to the agency responsible for investigating health insurance billing fraud. His retirement request was no longer valid. Emmett met him only once, in the parking lot behind the building, and he said only one thing: "You sold me 10 years that I can never recover, but you'll never sell them to anyone else." Then he walked away. Delia's professional license was restored on a Tuesday morning, without a celebration or reporters, only an envelope delivered to the address of her rented room. She read it while standing in the corridor, then placed it inside the cardboard box beside the framed photograph. Gus Barone left his position and went to live with a cousin in the suburbs. Each month, he continued sending money back without a letter, and Emmett never returned it, but never spent any of it either. Several months later, an old warehouse at Fox Point was converted into a rehabilitation center, offering free care to working families throughout the city. It opened without a ribbon cutting and without inviting the press. Delia served as its clinical director. Nell became the records assistant, and she was very good at keeping records because she had been doing it for a long time. The family name remained on the sign, and when Delia asked why, Emmett said the city needed to know that the name could mean this as well. On a spring evening, the two of them sat on the back steps of the center, while Nell practiced walking across the uneven paving stones in the courtyard, complaining about how many laps should be considered enough. "My little boy's name was Sam," Delia said. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud in many years. Then she added that he had loved soap bubbles. Emmett didn't offer comfort or make any promises. He merely remained seated beside her until darkness had completely fallen. Then he rose, walked inside, and turned on the courtyard light so his sister could see the path beneath her feet. This story leaves us with one simple truth: that a person's worth doesn't reside in the nameplate or title others give them. That what saves a life is often no miracle at all, but simply the steady presence of someone willing to sit down and ask the right question, and that no one deserves to be defined forever by the worst chapter of their life. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so you can hear more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel, and what remained in your heart most deeply? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.